So in some ways, it's really a pretty simple technique. It's just basically a jig and bobber is what it is. Just using a jig under a float. A float, bobber, same thing. So it's just basically just a variation on that jig and bobber technique. And a lot of fishermen around here use that technique this time of year for bank fishing, particularly on this particular lake that I fish, Fort Loudon Reservoir. It kind of lends itself to this style of fishing pretty well, which is, in a nutshell, it's basically wading out into the water a little bit if necessary, and using a jig up under a float to entice a little crappie to come up there and bite. Well, most people around here this time of year and on up through the spring don't fish all that deep. They'll usually have that jig maybe 2 feet up under the float, and they're trying to bring the fish up. They're using that technique where they bring the crappie up. Sometimes the crappie will get back into these shallow creeks, shallow flats back in these creeks, and they're not in real deep water, so they'll readily come up. They're looking for stuff to eat, so they'll come up and snatch something. So it's a good technique to use. Now, I tend to try to focus on the crappie that are a little deeper, maybe not so much trying to get them to come up and grab it, but more get it right in front of them. So in my technique, what I'm doing is fishing deeper, and instead of having the jig underneath the float a couple of feet, sometimes I'll be as deep as 7 feet, 8 feet, or 9 feet. Well, maybe not 9 feet, about 8 feet, 8.5 feet. Sometimes I can kind of squeeze that out of this one particular rod, but the technique is to kind of have the float fixed and then bring a leader off of the float, 4-pound test. So on the main spool of the fishing reel, I will be using 8-pound test monofilament line. It's a real durable fishing line. It's a Berkeley big game monofilament fishing line, I believe is what it's called. It's the cheaper stuff. You can get it at Walmart, and it's relatively inexpensive. So I use that as my main line, tie off onto my big float, little float, whatever I'm using, and then come off of the float with the leader, and that's 4-pound test usually, unless I'm going for something a little bigger like white bass. Then I may just have a 6-pound or 8-pound test leader coming off the float. But for the crappie, I like the 4-pound test monofilament leader coming off the float, anywhere on average for me probably between 7 feet and 8.5 feet. Now the water I'm fishing in would typically be anywhere from 8 to maybe 9 or 10 feet, really not that deep. So the trick is, as you're moving your float along with that much leader behind it, as you pull it along, you're basically trolling, and that's what the technique is. Essentially, it's trolling from the bank. So with this technique, I like to make a really long cast when I can, if necessary. I like to have that in my arsenal to be able to make a long cast, and then just bring the bait back at a real slow, steady retrieve. And the basic reason that I came up with this idea is that I watched so many fishermen who are out there trolling. They're in a boat, they're moving along at a steady speed, they're not jigging it, they're not doing anything to it, but bringing it along at a slow, steady speed. And I thought, well, that's obviously a technique that works, because they catch a ton of fish trolling like that at that very slow, steady speed. So I started kind of doing that from the bank, making the long cast and then just kind of bringing it back real slow. Now, I don't always do a slow steady. There's a little variation there, of course, you can do that you can't really do when you're trolling as easily.